various seminars and things over the years. And the truth is that we don't really know, even now, exactly how, Tom may have some of the answers in his sessions over the next 2 days, but we don't really know how young athletes adapt, and we've got to be very careful that we give them enough stimulus in order that they can improve and remain motivated, but not so much that that's to the detriment of their longer term performances. But I'm going to give an example this afternoon in my talk. If I started to work, I think you can start to do physiological tests on mid to late teenagers fairly safely, and that can give some indication about their relative fitness status. It can give you some indication about where their best event might eventually lie, but we wouldn't make any hard and fast rules on that, of course. But that can make it, it's a good sort of baseline from which you can then move on. But we'd be very cautious, I think, in being too prescriptive with younger athletes. It should still be pretty much a fun activity at that stage. Can I get other people's views on that? Well, because there's a lot of people in here who coach young athletes and have particular interest in it.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I wonder is the ongoing development of the child. So how much of the readings giving a false picture, because natural growing is going to change the picture anyway. Particularly when I read it, I'm ignorant of these things, but I read a lot about the female development, and so much can change during the teen years. It's very difficult to really establish what you have until later on. So I just wonder how much of you can take from early tests.
Yeah, I think with the females, I think if you get them at 16, 17, 18, you're starting to get towards a mature physiological specimen by that stage. It may be less the case in the males. Sometimes you've got some late developers. So you've got to be very careful about what you predict they're capable of at that stage and what you believe their weaknesses and strengths to be. But on the other hand, I think there can be useful information. It's a good experience, hopefully, for the athlete, but useful information for the coach as to how that person's developing. So they should continue to improve test on test and year on year. Of course, what you can't tell for definite is how much of that is consequent to the training that you prescribe and how much of it is a natural consequence of maturity and ageing.
One thing I noticed is I've coached quite a lot of kids from quite a young age. Some of them were sort of about 9, 10 when they started. And I noticed that all the boys, particularly in the group, if I coach them through the sea, 16, 17, 18, when they were ready, they were incredibly tall. Do you think that's because they were training through their peak growth spurts? And when you consider them against their parents, that's what I'm saying, it's the height you'd expect them to get to naturally. They were, a lot of them were way beyond that. And a lad I started coaching at 14, he was the only one who continued to grow. He's probably missed that peak growth spurt early on. Do you think that's right?
I don't know. Can I ask you to come in there, Tom? I mean, you'd know better than anybody.
It's a terribly complicated question, and that's why he's having me answer. It really is, and I think you're aware of this concept that the more expert performers eventually are those who have earlier birth dates in the year, and so that supposedly comes down to the fact that they were earlier developers. And not only are they selected early on, but they at the end are still more, there's a greater contribution of people with earlier birth dates in the year, and that's because those people have had more advantage of coaching early on. So you have to throw that in there. Then you have to throw in the question of which sport are you talking about. I mean, gymnastics, I'm sure it's much different than basketball in terms of the question that you're asking. So I'm going to throw this back to Andy.
I think the key question, I think, was if you train during the growth spurt period, could you augment that, or could you blunt it? Do you have any? There's no evidence.
It's unknown, and that's a very key question.
Susan?
I was just going to give the ideal scenario where I'm an identical twin and I have identical twins, and the boys are, one of them's a good runner and the other one's a lazy runner. Okay, so the lazy runner is slightly more muscular and slightly larger, but he had his growth spurt just prior, 6 months prior to Jake, who's sub 3 minutes, sub 2 minutes as a 16-year-old. And it was very interesting to see that as soon as he had his growth spurts, which was delayed, he then became taller. So he's now not a head taller, but he's half a head taller, which I find very interesting because you have two clones here.
Genetically identical.
Yes. So.
I'm also a twin, and my twin's much shorter than I am, but he didn't engage in any sport at school at all. So I'm assuming that because I engaged in sport at school, in athletics, part of my development was as a result of being engaged in sport, as where he wasn't. But surely part of the question that we're going back to must be based on, genetics, the parenting and where you come from, really, because to a certain degree you're going to be designed as a result of that, and how you develop as an athlete may well be truly depend on that process.
I would also be quite interested in the other end of things. We have quite a few plus 60, quite a few plus 70 folk running, and I'd like to know what you think about that also.
Well, the interesting thing about the older adult, as they're now, that's the politically correct rather than the elderly, is that they don't decline quite as much as you might expect as long as they continue to remain active. And there seem to be some muscular compensations. And Tom can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but as you get older, you lose your maximal heart rate goes down by about 1 beat per minute per year. And your VO2 max is dependent on your maximal cardiac output. Your maximal cardiac output depends upon your maximal heart rate and your maximal stroke volume. So as long as you continue to train, you can keep your maximal stroke volume quite high, but nevertheless your cardiac output is going to drop because your heart rate's going down. But nevertheless, what we find is that as athletes get older, the decline that you might expect as a function of the reduction in VO2 max with age doesn't actually become manifest, and that seems to be because it's offset by continued improvements in muscular efficiency. So athletes can become more economical, whether that's physiological or biomechanical or a bit of both isn't really known. But fatigue resistance seems to improve in the periphery in the older adult as well, and it may be that they can continue to grow mitochondria, to grow capillaries, and so the efficiency offsets the reduction in the maximal cardiac output.
That could also be a very psychological thing as well, because they tend to get more stubborn,
No, I think it's
or grumpy. I mean, Bill Bannon's a classic case.
No, I can't agree with that. Definitely not happier.
No, you tend to be able to, because of life experience, you tend to have quite, you can weigh things up better, can't you? So perhaps you can experience pain and put it into context easier.
Yeah, that's one thing that we can't measure very well, is the psychological aspects of that, but we don't discount them. Susan?
Can I just say, the area I'm quite interested in here is, this is probably a little bit of a criticism. We see a lot of coaches coaching young teenagers on adult training, and I kind of feel in a way that they automatically get good results because this kid has gone from nothing to something, but they've got nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
And I think really the blurred area for me is at what point is your teenage athlete ready to step up, and what are the physiological signs other than the fact that they're now 7 foot and whatever.
Again, I'm not really sure there's any hard and fast answers on that, which is why it continues to perplex us all. It's interesting hearing what Seb said this morning, isn't it? That
Yes.
I think at various times he was training actually quite hard, relatively young,
Yeah.
when I didn't realise that was the
12.
case for him. So,
12 mile runs at
yeah,
14.
and I think it's very difficult to predict whether or not an athlete's going to be able to cope with that. And I think there's both psychological and physiological factors with regard to it as well. So, but I think you're absolutely right that what you can't afford to do is leave nowhere else to go. You've got to have the capability where they can train more frequently, for longer durations and at higher intensities, because if they're already ticking all of those boxes, there's no way they can continue to improve, and they're going to become continually frustrated as their rivals catch them up and eventually pass them.
And I think that's probably why we lose a lot of talented athletes at those latter teenage years.
Two things really. In answer, well not answer, but as an observation of what you were saying, there are some, if you watch a group of youngsters, there are some who will find working on what you would call an adult, perhaps the adults are doing the children's training, I don't know. But, looking at some of the results lately, perhaps that's the case. But if you sort of think of, you look at the children, some of them will be working very hard, and you can see they're working very hard, and they're flogging themselves, and the coach is flogging them, and their parents on the side are flogging them. Whereas others, who are the same age, the same ability, same build, could be running quite easy. So it's a matter really, that's the coach's job there, as I think it was said earlier on this morning, you've got to be observing all the time, and you've got to think, well, no, that